The Legend of Zelda used to be my favorite game series ever, and I know I've switched my top 5 favorite games around a lot, so I'm just gonna say it. My top 5 favorite game franchises, I love all the same, and Zelda deserves to be up there. If you were anywhere on my channel in 2017, you will remember the cancerous Zelda theories I made.
Where not only did Link stab with the Master Sword, but the sages stab with the sage's sword.
Dear goodness, was the Breath of the Wild trailer really that long ago? And the awful Let's Play of Ocarina of Time.
Oh my gosh. I've never died this many times to this guy.
Yeah, that was the thing. But how could I not? This series is so good, and regardless of my negative views on the newest entry, I love all these games. Well, almost all. Ocarina of Time has some really interesting things to talk about. I mean, this game is commonly called the best, most critically acclaimed game ever, and that's saying something. This game didn't try anything stupid, it followed the most direct line to making a video game I've ever read about. I can only imagine what it would have been like being a kid in the 90s and walking out into Hyrule Field and being blown away by its size, or fighting Ganon and being amazed by the size of the Demon King. There's something very special about this game that all started with the development of the game. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time commenced during the same time when Nintendo was developing Super Mario 64. They presented the game in December at Nintendo Space World 1995. Back then, the game looked entirely different than what it looks like today. Perhaps the biggest change was Nintendo releasing the game as a cartridge rather than the Nintendo 64 disc drive release. Upon release, Nintendo confirmed that it was the biggest game ever to release on a Nintendo console in terms of megabytes. But let's go back before all the press and see where it started. Before development began, Nintendo and the team working on the game wanted the game so that it couldn't be compared to any other title. Early on, everyone involved in the game wrote down on a piece of paper what they wished to do with a 3D game, and all of those slips of paper were placed on a wall. The directors of the game would look through the various slips of paper and choose the ones that would best represent the series. They were especially drawn to the ideas that seemed impossible, knowing that no other developer had done such a thing at that time. One of the primary goals that the developers had was smoothly translating sword combat from previous games into a 3D world using lock-on targeting. Eiji Aonuma explained that if they had not been able to do this, the game probably would not have been very good. Due to there being absolutely no game that was similar to Ocarina of Time, the developers had to simply rely on their past video games that they had worked on for inspiration. Many of the people involved had created Super Mario 64 and Star Fox 64, so they had a general idea of how to create a quality 3D game. Eiji Aonuma stated that their biggest inspirations were the company's previous video games. Having Shigeru Miyamoto on board would also help them achieve their goals due to his vast gaming knowledge. Shigeru Miyamoto proposed making the game a first-person game rather than seeing Link through a third-person perspective. There were multiple reasons for this. For one, the player would be able to enjoy the environment of Hyrule more than he could if it were through a third-person perspective. He stated that when a player wishes to view his surroundings in a third-person game, they always would press a button that allows them to view it through a first-person perspective to better appreciate the world around them. Another reason he wanted to make the game a first-person title was that way they could focus more on the intention of creating enemies, dungeons, and the like. However, in order for the player to notice the distinct differences between child and adult Link, they had to make the game through a third-person perspective. He jokingly stated that another reason for making the game a third-person game was because it'd be a total waste not to have Link visible on screen when he looks so cool. So let's go over some key developments that really turned this game into what it is today. The targeting system was entirely new to video games, and the camera mechanics were unprecedented. In previous games, some of the developers felt that it was challenging to go exactly where you wanted your character to go while moving in a 3D environment, especially when you plan to attack an enemy. For example, it may be a bit more of a challenge to stop on a Goomba in Super Mario 64 than it would be in a 2D game like Super Mario World. With a game like Ocarina of Time, the developers had to come up with an idea to conquer this disadvantage, and thus they came up with the targeting system. In an Iwata-esque interview, Aoza, one of the game leads, said they were watching a ninja show, mainly just to get out of the sun because it was hot, but when they were in there, they saw one samurai in the middle, with ninjas surrounding him. One ninja pulled out a sickle and chain and swung it towards the samurai. The samurai caught the sickle and the ninja moved around him in a circle as to dodge. dodge, and that's where they got the idea for Z-targeting. Z-targeting is still used in games today like Dark Souls, which shows you how revolutionary this game's camera truly was. Eiji Aonuma explained that time travel was included to allow players to play as both young Link and adult Link. He said one of their goals with time travel was to have what young Link does in the past affect what happens in the future. They also wanted there to be a distinct difference between the two time periods, with Link's childhood being a peaceful place run by the Hylian royal family, and the adult Link phase being smitten by Ganondorf's malevolent rule. The team was influenced by the dual world of Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past on the SNES. An ocarina was an item that a player could use in The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, though it wasn't until this game did Miyamoto suggest allowing a player to actually play it using the N64 controller's buttons. Eiji Aonuma said they were also influenced to use it because the Nintendo 64 controller looks slightly like an ocarina. Early on in development, the team knew that they wanted to incorporate magic of some sort. They decided to do this using the ocarina. By playing a song that Link has learned, the player can cause one of many things to happen, whether it be changing the weather, talking to people far away, or causing the sun's light to appear in dark dungeons. According to Eiji Aonuma, the composer Koji Kondo had a hard time trying to think of catchy songs using a 5-note format. Using the controller as an instrument was used in many future games. Eiji Aonuma speculated that after the Ocarina of Time, Shigeru Miyamoto wanted to use this idea of controlling an instrument via the controller as a full-blown game. He accomplished that goal with the Wii game Wii Music. When creating the game, Miyamoto wanted to make absolutely sure that when Link exits Kokiri Forest and enters Hyrule Field, he would be awed with what he sees, a huge landscape with an outstanding musical score accompanying it. Eiji Aonuma has stated that this part of the game is his favorite. It tells the player right then and there, your adventure starts now. Field designer Makoto Miyanaga has stated that in the beginning, Hyrule Field was terribly uninteresting. There's barely anything to do, though planners decided to add things such as wind, temperature, and atmosphere. The changing time of day is also apparent in Hyrule Field, more so than any other location. Getting the sun to rise then set, followed by the subsequent moon, was a challenge for the developers, as was getting the correct color tone as well. The Nintendo 64 was capable of producing fog, so they took advantage of it, though Makoto Miyanaga stated that they didn't want to overuse it, so they had an appropriate amount of fog during the different times of day, with the morning having the most. As the day progressed, they altered the thickness of the fog, which is really interesting. Eiji Aonuma and the dungeon designer Eiji Onizuka both said that the reason why they included the horse Epona was purely because Shigeru Miyamoto simply liked horses and wanted to include one in the game so Link could ride it. There weren't any other games where the player could ride a horse, and since Miyamoto wanted the game to be unique, he decided it would be a good idea to incorporate it in the game. Originally, he speculated if he should just include the Pegasus shoes from A Link to the Past as a form of transportation, though came to the conclusion that riding something that you could interact with would be a lot more fun. According to Shigeru Miyamoto, he would go to riding clubs when he wasn't working, and they would give him photographs of horses so that he could reflect those designs in the game. He knew, however, that creating a horse would become a huge challenge for the developers, though Yoshiaki Koizumi presented an experiment that he created, and it became clear that they would be able to do it. One obstacle they ran into was Hyrule Field had way too many trees, and that the player would often run into them while riding on top of the horse. They started to remove them, and it eventually became what it is today. In the game, the player is able to call Epona using the Ocarina of Time and playing Epona's song. According to Shigeru Miyamoto, the player could originally use a reed pipe in the game, though because it was quote-unquote too much trouble, they eventually switched it to the ocarina, and in the end, the reed pipe wasn't even included in the game. Now let's talk about some challenges the team had to face. In 2D games, the distance of a particular object or enemy is clear to the player, though in a 3D environment such as the one presented in Ocarina of Time, this is not the case. The sense of perspective is lost to the player in many early 3D titles, and creating a system in which this wasn't the case was one of the hardest challenges that the Ocarina of Time team at Nintendo had to overcome. Another challenging thing was creating walls out of polygons, according to dungeon designer Eiji Onizuka. According to him, Link had a variety of impressive maneuvers, but unfortunately many of his moves would cause him to clip through walls, such as the hookshot. According to Onizuka, the mappers of Ocarina of Time, of which there were 3, had the most trouble of the entire game, and he said there would be on occasions where they would actually cry. There were many times when the designers would change basic moves of Link, which would cause the mappers to totally redo what they had done in the maps to accommodate what the designers had altered. Although the team did have issues, this game absolutely knocked it out of the ballpark on the development side of things, from changing Link's design to be on par with Titanic to the massive sandbox. This game's development is as epic as the game itself. After waking from a nightmare, you're summoned by the Great Deku Tree. It's here where the game gives the player full control and doesn't hinder the player's desire to run around. You know you have a task, but you're allowed to freely run and discover the mechanics of the game. It feels like you learned the game, and that's rewarding. This game was designed to make it easy for players new to 3D games a chance to grasp and understand the concept behind what was going on. But back to the idea of giving the player full control. That's what this game did, and I think that's one of the main reasons why this design of gameplay so easily takes the cake alongside Halo CE for understanding this is a game, and a game is meant to be played. It doesn't tell the player, no, you can't explore, it says explore and discover, and that philosophy, along with some of the other things I'll cover in a bit, put this game at the top alongside Halo CE. Letting the player learn the mechanics by themselves is how you create an experience that lasts. Finding the Kokiri sword in the back of the forest quietly teaches the player to explore. Collecting 40 rupees to get the shield quietly tells the player they will have to find items to get certain key items. And this all builds together to make Kokiri Forest one of the best starting locations ever. It introduces everything you need to know when you start out, like context-sensitive A button commands. The team elaborated on A being the action button in Link to the Past, but helped it be more precise by letting the player know when to climb, push, crawl, and grab. This is something that Nintendo started that would show up in so many games after it. Another thing I mentioned briefly was Z-targeting. Like I said, this also appears in almost every action-adventure game as of now. But focusing on Zelda, this was the logical evolution from 2D combat to 3D combat. Z-targeting is what makes Ocarina of Time's combat so fun and streamlined. It's almost like a dance, and different enemies have different dances, and you have to learn to keep the rhythm of combat, and if you miss a beat, you pay the price. Once again, Kokiri Forest shows the player how to do basic combat by throwing 3 Deku Babas at you. It's here where you are forced to use your sword because your only other option is to run away. But not too far down the road, you run into more enemies that show you that those slim options for combat are about to change, because the next enemies teach you that there's always an alternative way to deal with enemies. With the old top-down Zelda games, you were almost guaranteed a hit whenever you approached an enemy, because you only had to worry about an X and Y axis. But with the Z axis in Ocarina of Time, you have to acknowledge the depth of enemies and what item you'll use to attack said enemy. And like I said, it's like a dance, and you have to learn the rhythm too. Every battle you can always deal more damage, and thanks to Z targeting, it allows you to use other items seamlessly thanks to the C buttons. The 2D combat transitioned perfectly into 3D and brought a really unique way to fight battles that would become an industry standard in all 3D action adventure games. The style of levels are amazing too. The design of the Great Deku Tree is ominous and thought-provoking, but peaceful and tranquil. The atmosphere of the entire place screams explore. The ambience in the background really builds the desire to search. This expands to all the dungeons and temples in the game. The Great Deku Tree is a perfect starter dungeon. It's simple in design but manages to make every little discovery feel good, and that gives you courage for the journey ahead. The Great Deku Tree builds upon the basic things you learn before entering. It takes those simple steps and says, okay, take one step forward. And it's great. The learning curve isn't insane, it's understandable, and builds upon each dungeon. Dodongo's Cavern amps up the heat, no pun intended, with throwing more interesting puzzles and tests your ability to use Z-targeting in the Z-axis with flying keys, the hall blades, and this removable wall. It builds upon each skill and I love it. It also allows you to get used to the bombs before you even get to use the bomb bag. It lets you understand how the item works, so when you get the bomb bag, you have a rough idea of how when bombs explode and what time you should use them in combat, which is the type of teaching that really works. And when you get to the boss, you get to use your new skills to destroy him. Jabu Jabu's belly teaches the player to use boxes to hold switches down that won't stay down by including Princess Ruto. To Minnie and myself, when I was younger, her inclusion was annoying, but when you really step back and look at it, it's the game silently teaching the player more skills. When you get the boomerang, the game teaches you that maybe your sword can't kill everything by making some enemies only killable by using the boomerang, which I think it really shows how much thought went into these dungeons. When you head to the Forest Temple, the game lets you off the leash and lets you go at it by yourself finally, and that makes sense. Unless you're an idiot, the game clearly laid out the basics and now it's your turn. The hookshot, this Forest Temple becomes a sandbox of experimentation. I remember getting the hookshot and trying to latch onto everything. It's so satisfying when you discover something using it. This thing was nerfed to hell and back though, as it would be absolutely broken if it worked the same as it did in Link to the Past. Being able to latch onto any static surface would be a nightmare for the designers, so it makes sense why they made the hookshot's capabilities limited. The Forest Temple is filled with interesting puzzles that really keep you on your toes, and with the inclusion of the hero's bow in this dungeon, new puzzles can not only be solved, but it makes you feel like an absolute god at the game when you manage to hit an enemy with it. The utility of the weapon is great, and they truly made it fun to use. The Fire Temple is not only one of my favorite dungeons, but it's also the most memorable one for me. The reason being, I managed to get a 1.0 cartridge, which means I got the chanting in the background of the temple. and I thought there was actually something wrong with my game. It genuinely freaked me out. Well, it turns out Nintendo, upon creating the music track, used a soundbite from a sound library that had Muslim chanting. When they realized that this went against their rules about not putting religious images in any of their games, they replaced all the crescents and chanting in the game. Despite that, they still never got rid of Based Link. The Fire Temple created a feeling that truly gives the player motivation to move forward. The heavy music with a fiery background mixed together with the fun and challenging puzzles and saving the Gorons always makes you feel so cool. And the main item you get, the Megaton Hammer, always makes me feel so cool and like a force to be reckoned with. Carrying a massive hammer around and swinging it to deal devastating amounts of damage with the trade-off of not being able to use a shield was so epic. Even though it works mainly as a key to jam switches into place or knock blocks out of the way, it's still my favorite weapon alongside the double helix sword from Majora's Mask. Also, they removed the Muslim chanting like I said earlier, and yeah, I understand why, but the chanting added a sort of atmosphere that was lost in the 3DS remake that was later released. But nonetheless, it's still a great dungeon. The Water Temple does a great job of throwing everything at the player and expects the player to know everything by now. It does a great job of letting off a cold, empty, and mysterious feeling, and I love it. A lot of people say the Water Temple is hard and confusing, but I've gotten to the point to where I can run in and out of this stuff at Sonic speed. Yeah, I wasn't joking when I said this is one of my favorite games. The only temple that actually gave me trouble was the Forest Temple. Yeah. The Longshot is a collectible item, and it's a logical upgrade to the regular hookshot, and it allows for more creativity when fighting enemies and reaching ledges. I understand when people say this is a hard dungeon, but generally speaking, it's a more challenging temple that I personally had no issue running through. The Shadow Temple is probably the most interesting temple in the game. Not only does it have a lot of lore packed in that gives you a sneak peek in the past of Hyrule, it also manages to make a fairly small dungeon feel long and creepy. It builds off the dark atmosphere and the ambience to create an experience that just blew my mind when I was younger. Using the lens of truth to see through the walls makes the player get a sense of hope and truth. The Shadow Temple's aesthetic really makes you feel on the edge of your seat, constantly worried about what's around the next corner and how you'll even make it out. It's a brilliant dungeon design for the most interesting temple in Ocarina of Time. The Spirit Temple is my favorite temple. The scorching sun and the sandy ground with the brown brick walls always make me feel like a true hero. The temple has you travel back in time to play through a portion of the temple that you can't get to as an adult. Once you beat that portion as a kid, you get access to the Silver Gauntlets, the absolute coolest item in the game, which you upgrade later into the Golden Gauntlets. But as an adult, you run through the other side and defeat an Iron Knuckle and get the Mirror Shield. With this new item, you can reflect light off the face of the shield and unlock new doors and items. The Spirit Temple is my favorite for the design and bright setting, and it never gets old. All the bosses in these temples are great. They have really interesting names, and they're so fun to fight. None feel cheap, and none feel absolutely annoying. They all feel right, and the learning curve is great. None of them are extremely tough, and none of them are too easy. This boss design is perfect. Ganon's Castle is a perfect collection of everything you just did. It throws many puzzles at you one last time to activate the sages, and when you get access to the staircase, the intensity builds as you run to the top, facing enemies. Your journey is coming to a close, and when you get to the top, Ganondorf is playing the organ the entire time waiting for you. I can't explain the sheer intensity this part gives off. The entire game revolved around this singular moment and you're finally here. The boss fight is challenging and fun, the escape from the crumbling castle is insane and intense, the final battle with Ganon is extremely iconic. I love this game and it ends in such a high note, and that's what made this game amazing. All the temples and bosses are challenging and fun, all give you motivation to move on, and it's amazing. But we're not done yet. After becoming an adult, you head to the graveyard and find a mini dungeon under a gravestone. Upon falling in, you're tasked with chasing Dampé around a maze to get the hookshot to enter the Forest Temple. The game throws more mini dungeons at you, like the Ice Cavern, where you have to find the Iron Boots and get Blue Flame to thaw the Zora King. And then there's the well. My goodness, is this terrifying. There's skeletons, blood, torture devices, re-deads, and things from frickin' Dark Souls in this mini dungeon. This mini dungeon is not for the faint of heart. It's absolutely insane. I honestly want to ask Miyamoto what he was thinking when he said to put this in the game. But anyways, before the Spirit Temple, you get thrown into prison for being a man because Ganondorf kinda made guys look bad for the Gerudo. You have to free the workers and escape without getting caught. I love this little mini dungeon. It was so cool. Another thing that's cool are all the side quests that give you items that make things easier. For instance, the Begoron Sword quest. This is a 33-minute quest. It's the longest side quest in this game because you constantly go back and forth and sometimes have a time limit. It's not easy. But the end result is an epically large sword that really helps in the final battle. Another iconic side quest is the Golden Skulltula side quest. This side quest is really helpful because it allows you to carry more rupees, which is really helpful again because if you get one of your special tunics eaten off by a like, tunics cost 200 rupees, and you can only carry 99 at first. All these things help to make this game that much more expansive in terms of content. Like searching for heart pieces. Allowing the player to explore and find these things naturally is so perfect. The design is crafted to make you feel like you found it, and not like a developer held your hand and showed you how to get it. And that's the thing, this game made the obvious not obvious, making things like the fairy fountain seem more mysterious, which gives the player motivation. The shops share a similar purpose in giving the player motivation, and also they're just cool to go in. Seeing all the items you can buy and managing your rupees is so cool. Also, the shop owners are either funny or just pretty cool when it comes to design. The shop designs feel like a safe room from Resident Evil, and the fact that here you feel like you can slow down and think. Traveling across Hyrule Field is so fun and interesting. Riding to Hyrule Castle, Lake Hylia, Zora's River, and Gerudo Valley always felt so fun. You'd think because Hyrule Field is a couple of trees and a wall it'd be boring, but because this game is so fun, it managed to make its most expansive and slightly empty area so fun to run around in. And who can forget the fishing game? Also, there's hidden areas like fairy fountains and little treasure holes, which is really cool and once again gives the player motivation to move on. Another thing I wanted to cover was the OST. This soundtrack builds off the location and not vice versa, meaning when you're in the forest temple it feels like you're actually in a forest temple. I feel like the water temple conveyed this the best, but in all actuality every temple conveys this perfectly. It also expands beyond the temples, with places like Kakariko Village, Hyrule Castle Town. They all have songs that fit their design. My favorite of the locations is Zora's Domain. It always felt calm and peaceful, and I love it. One last thing I want to cover is the Ocarina. This is the cornerstone of your adventure. Without this, the world would have been lost to Ganondorf. The mighty tunes you play on this thing are some of the most iconic music jingles ever, and I can see why. The Bolero Fire's strong tune to Requiem of Spirit's mysterious sound. This game knew how to make an item carry presence, and they did it phenomenally. The people in Ocarina of Time feel really lively. They don't act like brick walls or cardboard cutouts. Some have actual personalities, character development, and interesting side quests. Some of them are actually interesting and show up in later Zelda games like the Postman. The way this game handles NPC interaction is probably one of the best ways you could possibly do it in a game. Another thing is all the hub-like location, those being Kakariko Village, Kokiri Forest, Gerudo Valley, Hyrule Castletown, Death Mountain, and so forth. Each location feels so cool. I love Goron City. The idea of a cave village was always so cool to me, and the lighting is perfect. Death Mountain Crater is another one that's one of my favorite locations. It feels so dangerous and huge, and who can forget Lake Hylia? I mean, come on, it's so cool. It's a massive lake with a temple underneath it. It's amazing, and I love the laboratory at the top. It gives me some Majora's Mask vibes. After beating the game, you turn off your console and move on. Whether you played this game as a kid or an adult, this game doesn't hide its mature subtext. It's very open about it, but you still have to look for it. The game follows a young boy tasked with saving Hyrule and the world from an evil man from the desert, Ganondorf. He must travel through time itself to wake 6 legendary sages to seal Ganon. But just like you, after beating the game, the characters and even Link move on. They forget everything and it becomes a story. And that's what Ocarina of Time is about. Time. Everything this game shows represents the life we all lead, and it all starts with a call to duty. Link wakes up, beats an evil monster, leaves his father and mother figure, meets new people, grows with them, makes commitments, and when the time comes, he matures. Here the world isn't bright and happy anymore. Link's childlike innocence is no longer there. He sees the world the way everyone else did, broken, lost, and evil. But unlike most, he steps up to be the one who's gonna change everything. He goes to 6 temples, wakes 6 friends who move on. He beats the evil that was holding him and everyone back, and in the end, everyone moves on, and he's forgotten. All these things we all go through. We all grow up, we all meet people, we all face an evil within us, and we come to an end. Sheik makes this game's point very clear. Throughout the game, Sheik teaches you different songs and what they mean and stand for. Each song shows a growth and the walk of life, and how the end is inevitable. And that's why all our past experiences are made to be remembered, and how we need to live life to the fullest in the time we have. And in the end of the game, we see Link is alone. Everyone, including Navi, left Link. And he moves on in search of her because he won't let go. He holds on to the past, and that led him to live a life that he regrets. And when people ask how a story about a guy beating a massive demon pig is relatable, it's because we all grow up. The flow of time is cruel, as Sheik says, and we can all relate to Link in that regard. Every time I play this game, I feel like I'm playing with Link and not as him. This game made Link stand apart. He comes across like a blank slate character, but he actually has depth, and that's why we can all relate. In every playthrough, I remember the fun I had back when I first played the game. I remember the people in Hyrule, I remember my favorite locations, and just like the game itself, those are all things of the past, and it's nice to look back on those memories. This game offered something that no other game or story in general could. It helped me understand growing up is difficult, but it's a good thing and everyone goes through it. It helped everyone see what it's like to be alone. It translated life perfectly. This game managed to become timeless because of the message and story it shared. It's a game that taught us to grow, and maybe the graphics aren't great, and maybe the camera can be difficult, and everything else has aged about it, but the story, characters, and meaning haven't aged a minute. And that's why Ocarina of Time will always be more than just a perfect game. It'll always be a perfect story. This game is so nostalgic. It was my second Zelda game I ever played, and like most, I fell in love with the captivating story, and it's truly plunged me into the series and gave me years of enjoyment, crafting theories, and even showing up in other people's Zelda videos. I have a lot to thank this series for, and specifically this game. It gives me chills remembering all the fun I used to have with this series, and I want that connection back. So hopefully, with this series of videos I'm playing on this franchise, I'll hopefully get back into the series, and who knows, maybe I'll make some more cringy theories. But as always, I'll catch you guys later, bye.